Even from the beginning of the lockdowns, there were great efforts on the part of many medical professionals and scientists to get the word out that none of this made any sense. It contradicted public health policy from time immemorial. Whatever you name it, the masking, the 6 feet of distance, which Fauci yesterday said just came out of nowhere. He has no idea where. Of course. And the plexiglass and the sanitizer mania and the business closures, it was all tremendously destructive, and many people opposed it.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. The COVIDians have retreated, but by no means have they surrendered. Chicago hospitals are under mask mandates. A St. Louis public health director unilaterally imposed a citywide mask mandate before she had to relent to a strongly recommended posture after blowback from local and state politicians. Mr. Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce, is all over television telling you to get the latest jab. He must be long on Pfizer. The COVIDians now throw in RSV and the flu. Hey, flu, we missed you for a couple years. Into their saving lives rap. This is why I found the loose talk about COVID amnesty so odd. While there are certainly some who've regained their sanity and even expressed recriminations, most of the drivers of COVID mania have neither offered apologies nor sought absolution. So we press on without them and circulate the mounting evidence of how unnecessary the mitigations were and how much social, emotional, and economic damage the false promises inflicted. Part of pressing is to memorialize what occurred, Truth Commission style. Part of it is to assess what is to come in places like America's major cities, which have become magnets for every misanthrope and mind freak under the sun. To aid us in these analyses, we're pleased to be joined by a gentleman who helped organize the Barrington Declaration and who provided invaluable skepticism and scholarship throughout the pandemic. He is Jeffrey Tucker, the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute and the author of the book Liberty or Lockdown. Jeffrey Tucker, thank you for joining us on Counterculture. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So why don't we start with the Great Barrington Declaration, because that seemed to me like a real inflection point during the pandemic. And of course, the fallout from those who participated in the Barrington Declaration continues with doctors like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff being party to that Missouri v. Biden case that's before the Supreme Court. So just, the description of what it was like to organize it, what the impetus for it was, and the importance you think it ultimately had in the discussion and understanding of what was happening in real time with COVID policy.
Even from the beginning of the lockdowns, there were great efforts on the part of many medical professionals and scientists to get the word out that none of this made any sense. It contradicted public health policy from time immemorial. Whatever you name it, the masking, the 6 feet of distance, which Fauci yesterday said just came out of nowhere. He has no idea where. Of course. And the plexiglass and the sanitizer mania and the business closures, it was all tremendously destructive, and many people opposed it. Really early on, there were press conferences on Capitol Hill by doctors who said this response is going to be very bad for the immune system and have tremendous collateral damage. There were two doctors in California, Southern California, that held a press conference and said, listen, if we continue to stay inside like this, we're going to develop an immunity debt that will be paid later. It's going to make you sicker in the long run. So it was very good. But the problem is that there was a great deal of censorship, even from the very start of the lockdowns. In fact, there's evidence that the censorship regime got fired up sometime in February, even before the lockdowns. So then we went through the summer and then the fall, and by this time, it seemed like something needed to happen to get through the mess. And so Sunetra Gupta from the UK and Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya got together and wrote a really short, really what amounts to a small statement of principles or something. And then we pushed it out, and Yeah, in the form of I just happened to have some tools that was able to break through the censorship apparatus. Partially it was an independent domain and a independently hosted server. It wasn't on Amazon servers. It was on a private server with a new domain that we had just bought really that day, and it got out there, and I mean, it was amazing that it actually broke through. But remember, this was October of 2020, so there was a tremendous effort on the part of Fauci and the NIH, which is the National Institutes for Health, and the CDC generally, to suppress this by name. Because we had waited from March, when the lockdowns began, all the way to October for what they kept promising was a vaccine. Okay, but the problem was that there's never been in the history of vaccine science or practice a vaccine that successfully worked against a fast mutating respiratory virus that was spread through aerosols and also had an animal reservoir. So what that means is that it mutates too quickly. You can't possibly have a vaccine for this sort of thing. So it was all just pretty ridiculous, and we knew this early on. And so, it didn't matter whether you had a vaccine or not. I mean, we weren't going to vaccinate our way out of this pandemic. There was no chance of that. So the Barrington Declaration just said, look, you need to let society function normally, as we always have since the beginning of time in the case of a respiratory virus like this. And further said that if you're vulnerable, and we know who those people are, that you should have the freedom to go about your business, or, as people would typically do who are vulnerable to this kind of infection, protect yourself and stay away from crowds and that sort of thing. But otherwise, government doesn't need to intervene. That was the message. But the problem from the point of view of people like Fauci and all of his cohorts, including Francis Collins at NIH and the industry that was backing the vaccine, is that they already had a vaccine ready to roll out. They didn't want to roll it out until after the election because they didn't want Trump to get credit. So Fauci kept delaying the rollout, hoping to get to first week of November and then roll it out. And that's in fact what happened. But the Barrington Declaration became extremely inconvenient for them because they had worked for all these months. We're talking about March, April, May, June, July, August, September. So, 8 months basically to keep everybody in a constant state of frenzy and intensify the public demand for the vaccine, for the great antidote that was going to fix everything. They had worked for 8 months to keep and prolong the sense of panic and fear, to prepare people for the great vaccine rollout, which they hoped would make billions of dollars for Moderna and Pfizer, and then prompt a whole series of other things like vaccine passports and centralization of medical information on all the citizenry and all the rest that came with that. So they had it all they had a nice plan, and it had so far gone pretty well. They had, this is Bakersfield, California doctors. They had suppressed them, the Capitol Hill press conference, which included Joe Ladapo, who's now Surgeon General of Florida. They had suppressed everything up to that time and increasingly censored accounts, taking people down from LinkedIn, and so on and so on. Twitter was operating as basically a voice of the federal government at that point. So everything had gone swimmingly up to that time, and they only needed another month, and then their plans would be deployed perfectly. So the Great Barrington Declaration came out. It was extremely inconvenient to them, and that's why they ordered a series of articles written in their kept publications like Wired and Slate and all the rest of this, and Rolling Stone and all the rest of the nonsense, to denounce it. But the more they denounced it, the more attention it kept getting, because now, after watching all the rioting over the summer in the name of George Floyd protests, and just sick of seeing not going to church and seeing all the businesses closed and having the kids kept out from school, the public was getting increasingly angry and looking for other answers. The government by then had already been discredited. So it was a kind of a strange combination of factors that led to the prominence of the Great Barrington Declaration. I think there would have been public resistance regardless, but that coming out when it did ended up being a significant sort of moment in the history of the pandemic response.
And what's your assessment of where we are now? You know, I mentioned in my intro, there was this talk of COVID amnesty for a time late last year, but I don't know if that was really coming from people who had fallen prey to the mania and really did want to sort of re-enter civil society, or if it was from those who maintained a healthy level of skepticism and kept their wits about them, but we're trying to give those people who had lost their minds a way back in. But either way, there doesn't seem to be a lot of real interest in a truth commission about what transpired and a reckoning about reckoning over under whose watch those things transpired.
Your intuition is correct. It was from both sides, both from the people who advocated for lockdowns and those people who were against the lockdowns but really just wanted us to move on and let the perpetrators of evil, just kind of save face, I guess you could say. So there was both sides behind the amnesty. But the problem with this idea of amnesty is that first you need to, as you mentioned, to know what happened. And we still don't know. I mentioned this earlier, but Fauci was before a House subcommittee yesterday, and they asked him where the 6 feet of distance thing came from. And he said, well, I don't really know. It just sort of showed up. Okay, well, the problem is that a lot of vendors got extremely rich printing stickers and making signs that were posted in every store, elevator, airport, church, civic, congregate place. I mean, even now they're still there. I mean, they're like a permanent part of the linoleum. Whether it's the "Walk This Way" stickers or the "No more than 4 people allowed in the elevator" stickers. Social distancing is everywhere. I mean, you go to the airport, there's still social distancing signs. It's like a part of our. It's strange. I mean, nobody pays attention to them, but they're still everywhere. That's 4 years later. Okay, so who came up with the idea of 6 feet of distance? I mean, in March 21, there was a series of scientists that did a controlled experiment involving 1,000 people in a congregate setting. One, they had everybody, do the 6 feet, and another one, they had people to do 3 feet. I wish they had done a third, which was just being like a normal person. That would have been nice, right? They did not have that. But they did discover that there was no statistically significant difference at all in infection rates between those who were doing 3 feet and those who were doing 6 feet. And they published this in a very prestigious journal in March of 21. And so we knew this. And the New York Times, in the middle of March 21, this would have been 2 months after Biden took office, said, "Oh, it turns out there never was any basis for the 6 feet of distance thing. We've talked around and nobody can figure out where it came from. It's just completely made up out of thin air. There's no science behind it. The science refutes it." And so this New York Times, which in many ways had started the whole pandemic frenzy, hysteria, and advocated for lockdowns, was now, because Biden was in office, trying to dial it back, but even they couldn't do it. I mean, think about it. They were, because the social distancing stuff was what was keeping the schools closed. Because, of course, you can't have social distancing in a public school. It's ridiculous, right? You can't ride on the bus, line up at the water fountains. I mean, sit in the classroom with 30 kids. Social distancing was impractical to the extreme, and that's the excuse the labor unions used to keep schools closed. Well, this got the New York Times and other people that were on side of the lockdowns pretty panicked, because they realized, oh, well, it's a bad idea to keep schools closed, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. When is this all going to end? So the New York Times started pushing out information that would have caused the schools to open. But by then, the horse had left the barn. I mean, there was no putting this back in, because a major problem from the very beginning of the pandemic response is there never was an exit plan. There was never an end game. There was never a point at which you could say, oh, we achieved the thing through our great methods and now we can go back to normal life. That nobody ever said what that marker was. I mean, they would talk about time, like, oh, well, we need 2 weeks, so we need 30 days. But they never said, what the marker was. Was it the end of COVID? I mean, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. I mean, what was it? What metric could you use that was objective and clear? They never explained that. So the New York Times is trying to worry that people are getting pretty upset and try to dial back the response by pointing out there never was any science behind 6 feet of distancing. But the article made no impact whatsoever, and we kept going on with the madness. I mean, once you open this sort of proverbial Pandora's box, there was nothing anybody could do to fix it after that.
Well, I mean, to your point about no metrics on coming out of lockdown, no metrics coming out of emergency orders, no metrics coming out of the pandemic and declaring it over that were identifiable. But we know why, right? Mandy Cohen, now the CDC director, when she was a lowly state public health director, on that infamous Zoom call with other state public health directors, basically they told you what they were doing, which was just like, you tell me when you're going to do what you're going to do, and then I'll synchronize what I'm going to do in coordination with you. So it was just, let's just move as a group, because if we have a group, then the group is responsible generally, but no individual can be held accountable, right?
Yeah, excellent point. And that was a very revealing comment. It's funny, she's a little bit stupid. She just got relaxed, or maybe she had a martini or something, and she just inadvertently revealed the truth, that there never was science, that it was just bureaucrats, covering their butts and issuing edicts and loving it. And meanwhile, Fauci's got his mask on with little beakers and microscopes on it, as if he's like attached to the science, and even at some point said, I am the science. Well, there never was any science behind any of this, and that Mandy Cohen crack sort of reveals it. Here's what's critical. Everybody knows this now, right? I mean, this is it, and they expect to maintain their credibility. Well, their credibility is shot. I mean, they ruined our lives. They set the world on fire in so many ways with using a response that never had any basis in any kind of science or any kind of experience or any moral wisdom or law or anything else. That's what they did to us. And now you've got absenteeism in school up to 50%. You've got Ecuador blowing up yesterday because of so much demoralization and crime and all the rest of it. You've got a migrant problem that's taken over New York hotels, and they've even closed schools today to stick all the new migrants in the classrooms, and they're asking people to give up their homes to take in refugees. So, not to mention high suicide rates, excess deaths. And the critical issue, what happened was that they delayed the vaccine rollout for, I guess, 9 months. And then the vaccine came, and it was rolled out over the next 6 months. And it became clear very quickly that it did not stop transmission. It did not stop infection. And it was associated with a tremendously high rate of vaccine injury that was imposing medically significant consequences on a younger cohort population that was otherwise not vulnerable to COVID at all. So in other words, the vaccine made everything worse. Okay, that I'm pretty sure they did not anticipate. So that was a tremendous calamity. So you've got this situation, and I don't care what it is. You look at any of the problems in the world today, most all of it traces to lockdowns. I'll give you one example. We've been reading about the doors flying off airplanes over the last several days, okay? Well, it turns out that the company that was making those doors laid off most of their mechanics during the lockdowns and then never came back. So, this is a consequence of lockdowns too. I mean, they broke everything. And so much is broken. You can't get workers to do anything nowadays, and the skills have atrophied. Students are addicted to their cell phones, no kidding, and we're facing a tremendous health calamity. I mean, people put on average 20 to 25 pounds. Like the average person would put on 25 pounds that develops a substance abuse problem. So how does pharma respond to that? Oh, not a problem. We've got a new shot that's going to make you skinny. Okay, so now everybody's spending $2,000 to $4,000 a month on these idiotic shots to make themselves skinny, which shrinks your stomach and creates grotesque digestion problems. And then when they can't afford it anymore, they go off the shot and put on more weight than they started with in the first place. So it's like yet another round of pharma addiction. So I've just given you a few examples, but we are just at the beginning stages of this. I mean, the petty crime, the demoralization, the sickness, not to mention the inflation, all of which traces to the pandemic response. So on and it goes. The COVID response truly set the civilized world on fire, and we're still not done with it. We're not done with it. And more and more people are realizing this, that's all began with March 2020.
Well, and just to your point, too, one of the things that's really frustrating in terms of the cost-benefit analysis and looking at it with the hindsight of 2020, at least doing so honestly, you think about just what happened the other day when J.J. McCarthy led the Michigan Wolverines to the national championship in football. And J.J. McCarthy grew up not far from where I grew up. He went to the same high school my mom went to until the lockdown. And of course, Governor Pritzker in Illinois was one of the worst lockdown governors in the country. And because his parents had the means and the motivation to allow JJ to continue his football career, which he wouldn't have been able to do in Illinois during that period, they sent him to IMG Academy down in Bradenton, Florida. He continued his football career. He went on to star in Michigan. He won a national championship. But even him, you saw the profiles of him in advance of that championship game. He was suffering from depression. He learned how to meditate, and he still to this day meditates in the end zone by the goalpost before the games because of sort of the impact that the lockdowns had on him before he was able to get out of Illinois and get down to Florida. And so you just think about the opportunity cost, not even for kids going on to win national championship or star in college, but just how important sports or other social organization, extracurricular activities are, and how much days of lives lost there was, how much quality of life lost there was, and how long these impacts will be. They talk about long COVID, the impacts of the lockdowns, how long they will last, and we have no idea because it's going to vary from kid to kid.
You are so correct about this, and thank you, by the way, for focusing on this. I don't believe that we can just move on from this. We can't just say, oh, that happened and we're over it, and we have to come to terms with what happened. The story you just told is a very sad one and a kind of a heroic one in some way, but those kind of stories are in the millions, tens of millions, even billions all over the world. Everybody's got some tragic aspect of this that they can talk about it. And I think we should talk about it, and we have to talk about it just psychologically, politically, culturally, and every other way. We can't change the past, but we can at least be truthful about it, and we're not anywhere near that point. And just so we understand that it wasn't just like, okay, there's a series of mistakes, should we punish them or not, who did it to us? Yeah, all that's important, but they have every intention of doing this again, and they haven't rolled back any of the major machinery apparatus that did this to us. And I'll give you one example of this. After World War I, there was some internment camps that were built for German citizens and captured German soldiers, and they were thrown in them. That was the first time in American history anything like that was ever done, and it was decried for a very long time as being inhumane and essentially evil. I mean, they were forgotten about, right? Well, that was well over 100 years ago. That was like 1918 or something like that. This country has not built any quarantine facilities since that time. There were federally built quarantine facilities. I mean, there was an internment of the Japanese during World War II, but they just threw them in whatever kind of space they could. But for the federal government to specifically build basically a concentration camp, a place to put people. That hasn't happened in 100 years. Well, in fact, one started to be built in Omaha, Nebraska, starting in, as best we can tell, September, October 2019. And it was finished in January of 2020. And when that cruise liner called the Diamond Princess was, when there was word in, I think it was early February 2020, that that COVID had broken out on the ship, the U.S. government sent helicopters and rescued, quote unquote. Oh, sorry, that's some truck outside. Rescued Americans from the ship. Well, they didn't want to be rescued. They're on vacation. But anyway, the stupid military helicopters landed on the boat and picked them up, and they took them. And where did they take them? They took them to Omaha, Nebraska, at this quarantine facility, and stuck them in there for a month against their will. Okay, so that was a legitimate quarantining of Americans. Nothing like this has ever really happened. I mean, the federal government building a facility with taxpayer dollars and then putting American taxpayers in there against their will and sticking them there because they had a respiratory infection. Or they didn't even have a respiratory infection. They were just on a boat where there was a respiratory infection floating around. Well, that thing has been expanded over the next year. And then the federal government announced that they were going to build 4 more quarantine camps, which they have in Washington State, in California, Georgia, and New York. And each state is now passing executive orders, which you could call quarantine camp orders, that allows the government just to, knock on your door, grab you by the arm, throw you in a camp without any due process, legal representation, separate you from your kids. This is going on in every state in the country. So, you don't build these kind of facilities and this kind of machinery without the intention to use it at some time, because under the government rules, it's like you spend the money and you use the facilities, or you lose it to competitive agencies that want it. So these will definitely be used at some point for something. We don't know when, we don't know what, but they've learned all the wrong lessons. What they've learned from the COVID response was not that it was stupid and dumb and pointless and injurious to American lives and civilization. What they've learned is they can get away with it. They can exercise that kind of power, and they can do it for any reason they want. So that's the takeaway from the deep state, from what they did to us, is they've been empowered and ennobled, and they believe in what they did. Even though it was nobody else agrees with them, they believe that they can get rid of it. Now, the next time they have to change excuse a little bit, because people are kind of on to the infectious disease racket. So it'll be something else. It'll be climate change or terrorism or bank failures, or I don't know what it's going to be. But the point is that the government is more powerful than ever, and they're not giving up that power. They're going to continue to use it.
I wanted to get your thought on the big cities, sort of building off of that, because I know you recently wrote about sort of what does the future of big city America look like as people have fled big cities because of crime and, as I mentioned, all the other pathologies that seem to be welcomed in by big city politicians. So what is the future of big cities, and how does that relate to what you were describing more generally about the gambits that are in the offing for the same people who brought us the lockdowns?
Yeah, there's every reason to be concerned about that, and we're going to know more by the end of this year. But first of all, we know that big companies have not been able to get people back to the office. The office has become a very unpleasant place, thanks to DEI mandates and HR imperialism and hegemony. People don't like the office. They don't like the commute. Lockdowns introduced them vast numbers of professional managerial class to the possibility that they could stay home and do their work. And so they can't get them back to the office. So now we're still at just, basically half at best office occupancy as we were before the pandemic response. So Most companies now in big cities, whether it's New York or Houston or say nothing of San Francisco, but most big cities now have, most big corporations, most big cities have hybrid work policies. So they need a fraction of the office space that they had before. The leases, and these office spaces are typically taken out on a 5-10 year lease. Well, a lot of these leases are coming up in 24, and the companies are not going to renew the same amount of space. They're going to take half of what they had before. But we've got skyscrapers all over the country that are empty now, and if they cannot rent that space, they're either going to have to dramatically lower prices, which is going to press the bottom line for the owners and the people that are funding these things that are highly leveraged buildings, by the way, highly leveraged. They won't be able to make the bottom line. The accounting doesn't work. And then the banks can be stuck with the bill because people are going to be defaulting on the loans for the spaces, and they're going to have to try to figure out what to do with them. Well, now you and I might say, well, that's not a problem. There's a housing shortage. I mean, we could just put people in there, but you can't, because since World War II, the footprints of these things are incompatible with residences. They're meant to be offices, so they don't have windows, and nobody wants to live in an apartment without windows. So the only way you can convert these things is by literally cutting out the center of a 100-floor skyscraper, cutting out the whole middle and turning it into an atrium, which is a hugely expensive thing. And the only way you can get away with that is if you turn the results into a luxury apartment. So people are not doing it. So what's going to happen to all these buildings? It's not clear. And then if the buildings go into decay and end up having to be imploded, what happens to all of the commercial infrastructure in the city? Where, restaurants can't function, stores, street-level stores are not working anymore. They're already facing tremendous problems with shoplifting as it is. Now the customers are going to. They're going to close up shop. So, I don't know how this is all going to pan out, but you've got a potential dystopian situation. It's going to look like the last scene of Planet of the Apes or something, where the cities are essentially being emptied out.
Well, there is historical precedent. It's like, it's the history we don't know as usual. But Rome in antiquity had upwards of 2 million people. By the Middle Ages, Rome had 80 to 100,000 people. These big cities that have been hollowed out in the middle, they can be further hollowed out at the top and just be left with the bottom. And if that were to happen, or if it were to continue to happen gradually, it happened in Rome over a couple hundred years, but if that happens, they become less politically powerful, though, too. And now you have power that is diffused out into the suburbs and exurbs and even disproportionately to rural areas. And that really changes the potential trajectory of America if you have a cultural shift away from urban centers and to outlying areas, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a dramatic shift. And as long as we're on that, well, and that's going to really matter because ever since the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, we've had direct election of senators. It was originally supposed to be a bicameral Congress where the House was elected directly by the people. That's why it's sort of diffused through the states. And then each state had one senator each, but those were to be appointed by the state legislatures, which themselves were popularly elected in a diffuse way throughout the whole state, so that the senator from the state represented the interests of the whole state, right? But after the 17th Amendment, we had direct election of senators. It was a constitutional calamity. It fundamentally changed the nature of the Senate, which used to be the House of Lords. Now it just became another version of the House of Representatives. It was the most idiotic, short-sighted decision in American history. And so as a result, the big cities all elected the Senate. And that's why you have the Senate filled with all these blue state senators from what are essentially red states, because, everywhere in the country, the cities all vote left and everybody else votes right, or blue-red, right? And so the Senate's so blue because of the dominance of the big cities. But if everybody's leaving the cities, that's going to change that fundamentally. So we could predict over the very long term that the Senate will become far more red. And then you have the problem of outward migration from blue states to red states as a result of lockdowns. So, the infusion into Texas and Florida, when the next redistricting comes along after the next census, it's going to hugely decrease blue representation in Congress and vastly increase red representation. The mucky mucks of the White House and the DNC are looking at this and going, well, what do we do? Well, we know what they do. They import millions and millions and millions, 8 to 10 million migrants from wherever. They just want warm bodies anywhere in the world, and they let them run across the border and prevent Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California from enforcing border controls. And they're importing voters. Now, you could say, well, but these undocumented workers, undocumented people, not really workers, can't vote in elections. Yes, they can. They can vote in federal elections. They can't vote in state elections, but the federal government regulates its own elections, and they have every right to vote. I mean, Elon Musk was proving this yesterday, saying that all you have to do is print out a ballot and mail it in, and it doesn't matter if you have an ID or not. So this is a very, very cynical attempt on the part of the DNC to maintain power and to flood the system with migrants from all over the world as a way of counteracting the demographic trends, all of which seem to favor the red states.
He is Jeffrey Tucker. He's the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute. Jeffrey Tucker, thanks as always for joining us. We appreciate your time. Very good. Thanks again. I appreciate it.